stand on Canada's street in the village of Lake George on a summer afternoon, and it can be hard to believe this place was once one of the most dangerous military corridors in North America. Tour boats leave the docks, families walk near Shepherd Park, and cars roll past the Fort William Henry site without a second thought. But this whole southern end of the lake was once a vast armed camp. Fort George Road still closely follows the old military road built in 1755, and the ground around today's Battlefield Park, Fort William Henry, Steel Pier, and the lakeshore preserves the outline of a frontier war zone that drew thousands of men north toward Ticonderoga in Canada. In that world, one name keeps appearing again and again: Robert Rogers. Robert Rogers was born in 1731 and became the best-known ranger, leader of the French and Indian War in 1755. As the war intensified, he recruited frontiersmen from New Hampshire and neighboring colonies to serve the British in a style of combat that regular European troops were not built for. These men were scouts, raiders, guides, and intelligence gatherers. They moved in small parties, often in brutal weather, over rough ground, through deep snow, and across frozen lakes. They were expected to find the enemy first, hit hard, and come back alive with information. That was the job. And around Lake George, that job mattered more than almost anywhere else on the map. To understand why, you have to picture the corridor. From Fort Edward on the Hudson, armies moved north toward Lake George, then up the lake toward the French post at Carillon, now Fort Ticonderoga, and beyond that toward Lake Champlain in Canada. Fort Edward sat at what native people had long used as the Great Carrying Place, where travelers had to shift from the Hudson system toward the lakes. From 1756 to 1759, Rogers Island at Fort Edward became Robert Rogers' base camp and training ground. That matters for our story because if you want the beginning of the Rangers' Lake George story, it does not begin in the village itself. It begins on that island in the upper Hudson River, where Rogers trained men for the northern wilderness and where, on October 25, 1757, he wrote out the standing orders later remembered as his rules of ranging. Those rules are one of the reasons Rogers is still remembered. He did not invent frontier war, and he learned heavily from Native American methods of movement and fighting, but he turned those lessons into a practical field code. The modern U.S. Army still traces part of its ranger tradition back to Rogers and his standing orders. Their spirit is simple: be ready at once, move quietly, spread out, post security, trust terrain, report the truth, and assume the enemy is always near. Around Lake George, those were not slogans, they were survival. This is where Rogers learned, often the hard way, that one mistake in snow, darkness, or broken ground could destroy an entire patrol. One of the first major examples came in the winter of 1757. On January 15th, Rogers marched from Fort Edward to Fort William Henry. There, his men prepared provisions and snowshoes. On January 17th, with officers from several ranger companies, they moved out across the ice of Lake George and camped near the first Narrows. The following days took them farther north, 12 miles down the lake, then inland on snowshoes, then toward Lake Champlain. On January 21st, about midway between Crown Point and Ticonderoga, they spotted a sled moving on the lake. Rogers sent John Stark with 20 men to head it off while other parties tried to cut off retreat. They captured prisoners, sleds, and horses, and the captives gave valuable intelligence on French and Allied native strength near Ticonderoga and Crown Point. It was exactly the kind of mission the Rangers were built for: speed, surprise, prisoners, information. But that same mission also shows why Rogers became legendary. After taking the prisoners, Rogers decided to turn back. Rain had dampened weapons, so the men dried their guns and marched in single file over broken ground. That detail sounds small, but it echoes one of the ranging principles: move as if contact is coming and do not let one shot take two men. Then the ambush came. The French and their native allies had formed a crescent across a valley and opened at close range. Rogers was wounded in the head. Officers fell. Stark and others held high ground behind large trees and turned the terrain into a shoe. The firefight ran into darkness. The enemy tried threats, persuasion, and promises to make the Rangers surrender, but they held until night, let them slip away. By January 23rd, battle survivors reached Fort William Henry. In today's landscape, with paved roads and cars and cell service, it is hard to feel how isolated that retreat was. In 1757, it was cold, dark, wounded men in the woods, and luck. That winter fight helps explain the rules Rogers later set down. Don't forget nothing is the famous first line people remember now, but the deeper lesson was discipline under frontier conditions. Keep weapons ready, move until dark, sleep by turns, do not cross at the obvious place, never return by the same route if an ambush may be waiting. If someone is following you, circle back and ambush the ambushers around Lake George. These were not dramatic shores. There were conclusions drawn from frozen patrols, bad intelligence, enemy scouts, and sudden contact in timber and snow. Rogers's genius was not that he never failed. It was that he kept turning failure into doctrine. Then came 1757, and the south end of Lake George itself became a place of loss. Fort William Henry fell to Montcalm in August. Later local historical material notes that in December 1757, Rogers and his rangers came to examine the burned ruins of the fort. That image is powerful. You can stand along the lakeshore walk near Shepherd Park or the Fort William Henry grounds and know Rogers once moved through this same area not in triumph, but in the aftermath of disaster, looking at what had been one of Britain's key positions. Today, the shoreline is peaceful. In late 1757, it was a scarred military harbor. Burned boats, wrecked outbuildings, and the memory of terrifying siege warfare. The most famous Rogers story around Lake George, though, came in March 1758. On March 10th, after Israel Putnam's earlier scout had stirred alarm, Rogers left Fort Edward under orders with only 180 men. He himself complained in his journal that the enemy had likely learned of the plan. The route of march is still easy to trace on a modern map. First to Halfway Brook, then to the islands of the Narrows on Lake George, then to the west side at Sabbath Day Point. There, on the dark lake, Rogers sent an advance guard forward, some men going ahead on skates while others flanked along the shore. Just imagine the scene, moonlight on black ice. Men squatting low on the frozen lake, packs hidden in a thicket, no fires, no noise, and the mountain walls rising over the shoreline. On March 13th, Rogers moved by land in snowshoes along the west side of the lake, even below the mountain, so French scouts on the water would not spot him. He halted, waited for the day scouts from the fort to return, and then advanced in 2 divisions. Soon his men sighted what they believed was a party of 96 mostly native warriors moving on the ice of a rivulet below them. Rogers extended his line along the bank and waited until the enemy was in place, then gave the signal to fire. The first volley was devastating. Rogers thought he had broken them, but he had hit only the advance guard. The main body, hundreds more Canadians and native fighters, was coming up behind. In moments, an ambush became a counter-ambush, and the Rangers were fighting for their lives. What followed is the battle remembered as the Battle on Snowshoes, one of the fiercest Rangers actions of the war. Rogers rallied the survivors on defensible ground. The mountain guarded one side. Lieutenant Phillips and others were sent to seize rising ground before the enemy could get it. The lines closed to within about 20 yards, sometimes mixing together. In the smoke and confusion, men fired from behind trees and rough cover, exactly the kind of fighting Rogers's rules envisioned. But numbers mattered. His force was terribly cut up. Officers and volunteers fell. Parties were isolated. Some surrendered and, according to Rogers's account, were killed afterward. By evening, Rogers led off as many men as he could, reached Lake George and spent the night with wounded men and no blankets or fire before beginning the retreat south. It was one of his worst defeats and one of the main reasons his name endured. That battle also produced the best-known Lake George legend attached to Rogers, Rogers Slide, or Rogers Rock. Today, the Great Rock Face is visible from Black Point Beach, or from a boat on the lake, and the old story says Rogers escaped by sliding hundreds of feet down the mountain to the frozen lake. The more likely reality is that he descended through a ravine rather than literally sliding straight down the open face. Either way, the place kept his name, and that is important. Around Lake George, memory is often written into geography. Rogers did not just pass through this country. He stayed in the map. If you stand at Rogers Rock Campground or float in the water off Hague, you are viewing a landmark where fact and legend still overlap. Rogers was not finished with Lake George after that. In June 1758, Lord Howe ordered him out with 50 men in whaleboats to take a survey of the North Landing, the ground from the landing to Carillon, and part of Lake Champlain beyond it. Rogers camped at the place where Fort William Henry had stood, then pushed north to scout the landing and French position. One of his parties was caught by a superior enemy force, and losses followed. Even so, his reconnaissance fed the Great British Movement against Carillon. On July 5th, Abercrombie's army of nearly 16,000 embarked down Lake George in bateaus with the Rangers on the left of the advance. For a modern visual, that gives you a remarkable contrast. Today's excursion boats at Steel Pier in a calm recreational lake versus 1758, when the entire southern basin was jammed with military watercraft, artillery, stores, and men moving north in one of the largest inland military flotillas of the war. And when that campaign failed at Carillon, the south end of Lake George became a place of regrouping again. Local battlefield interpretation preserves that memory in the sunken fleet story. The British sank large numbers of boats in 1758 to keep them from French raiding parties and later recovered many in 1759. Today, divers and archaeologists still connect that underwater landscape to the war. So when you look out across the water near Million Dollar Beach, Steel Pier, or the Old Dock area, you are not just viewing scenery. You are viewing a harbor where armies launched, retreated, rebuilt, and tried again. with Rogers and his men repeatedly serving as the eyes in front of the main force in March 1759. Rogers was back in the same corridor on yet another hazardous mission. Starting at the first narrows, he pushed to Sabbath Day Point in extreme cold with Rangers, regulars, an engineer, and native allies. From there, he moved toward the isthmus overlooking the fort, sent men to observe crossings, and before dawn, crossed South Bay to strike French work parties on the east side opposite the fort. The attack succeeded. Rogers reported prisoners taken, others killed, and then a fighting retreat against pursuing Canadians, Indians, and regulars. By midnight, he and his men were back at Sabbath Day Point after a brutal 50-mile day. Many had frozen feet. The next day, they reached Long Island on Lake George and refreshed themselves with venison brought in by Rangers and native allies hunting near the shore. It is one of the clearest examples of what the Rangers actually were. Not simply fighters, but mobile intelligence troops who could scout, raid, guide engineers in surviving conditions that crippled ordinary units. So much of Rogers's Lake George story comes back to the rules. Move before dawn. Post sentries before eating. Keep scouts ahead, behind, and on the flanks. Use rivers, hills, swamps, and darkness as tools. Report exactly what you see, because the army behind you is acting on your word. When you lay those principles over the map of modern Lake George, they suddenly become practical and physical. Fort Edward and Rogers Island become the classroom. Fort William Henry and Battlefield Park become the staging ground. The near Sabbath Day Point, South Bay, and the West Shore become the testing ground. Rogers Rock becomes the legend. The rules were written on paper, but around Lake George they were learned in snow, blood, exhaustion, and fear. And Robert Rogers himself. He was brilliant, restless, audacious, and deeply flawed. He became famous because this war fit him. Later, during the American Revolution, he sided with Britain, organized loyalist ranger units, and eventually faded into debt and obscurity in London, where he died in 1795. That later life complicates the legend. He was not a simple hero from a textbook. But none of that erases what happened here. Around Lake George, Robert Rogers was the face of a new kind of warfare in North America. Irregular, mobile, intelligence-driven, adapted to forests, winter, and broken country. So if you want to follow his story, the route is already there. Begin on Rogers Island at Fort Edward where the rules were written. Follow the old road north toward the lake. Stand at Fort William Henry and Battlefield Park, where armies gathered and where Rogers walked among ruins after the fort fell. Move up the West Shore, toward Sabbath Day Point and the dark ice route of 1758, end at Rogers Rock. Visible from boat or shore where the man became a legend in the landscape itself. This is not just the story of one officer and his rangers. It is the story of how Lake George taught a generation of frontier soldiers to move, think, and fight in a world where the woods were as dangerous as the battlefield.